Last week, mainstream media was abuzz with reports alleging that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un had executed multiple members of his staff after denuclearization negotiations with the U.S. had failed in Hanoi earlier this year. Of course, the report that those from CNN to the New York Times chose to legitimize was in fact a single anonymous source in one South Korean publication. But that didn't stop media outlets and State Department officials from running with it. After only a few days of a month-old rumor being bandied about cable news without a shred of evidence or investigation, the very officials and family members that were alleged to have either been executed or sent to re-education camps were seen alongside the North Korean leader at an arts performance in Pyongyang. So, are we seeing North Korea playing a sophisticated game of intelligence? Or is the quality of journalism about North Korea lacking in both fact and context? Well, here to help us understand North Korea and the news about it is professor at DePaul University, organizer for the Answer Coalition, and author Derek Ford. Thank you so much for joining us, Derek.
So, Derek, can you tell us a bit about your research and experience regarding North Korea and what you would consider the biggest misconceptions right now are about that nation?
Well, that's a big question for sure. So I've traveled to the DPRK, I've traveled to the Korean Peninsula multiple times and worked with the Korean diaspora in East Asia and the United States for several years. And I mean, there's really so many misconceptions about the DPRK. Usually when I tell my students that it's important to really forget everything that you think you know about the country, that you've heard in the United States, because it's just ridiculous propaganda. And I think that this latest incident is really another manifestation of how ridiculous it is that these claims are taken from the Chosun Ilbo, which is an extremely conservative paper in South Korea that has multiple times already gotten these sort of propagated these accusations and then had them quickly disproven. So this isn't the first time. But to your question as to what one of the main misconceptions is, I would say relative to this issue, and the reason why we see these, sort of sensationalized, basically fake news propagating throughout the media, is to present the DPRK, the government there, Kim Jong-un, as sort of erratic and unstable and out of control and in a state of chaos. The U.S. has really presented North Korea in that light for decades. The media has also. But if you actually look at the policies and the history of North Korea, you'll see that there's a rapid or a sort of extreme continuity in policy, in decisions, in domestic and foreign policy. And so, with that context in mind, when you see these reports about the mass execution and purging of those who are so close to the top leadership, you are really initially skeptical. You take it, I guess, not just with a grain of salt, but with sort of metric tons of salt.
Yeah. Well, there's always been these sort of brutal reports out of North Korea over the years of leaders executing officials that didn't please them. And the stories go all the way to, it's shooting them with a missile at a military base or putting them, all this stuff. One thing I noticed was that in this recent story, in the original story that sparked all of this coverage, there very specifically at the end of it, it said the rumors have not been verified. And this is loosely translated, obviously. The rumors have not been verified, and it is possible the regime is deliberately spreading misinformation. Let me ask you this about North Korea. Is there a history of reports like this that are planted to manipulate the international press? And then if so, because it seems like it, why do major outlets like CNN and the New York Times keep falling for it?
Yeah, so I mean, the DPRK, obviously, it's very sophisticated. It's been, the United States has been at war with North Korea since 1950. And so they've never had a moment of peace. And so they've had to be incredibly, smart and agile in terms of how they relate to the United States, how they relate to the entire world. And so there are definitely instances of the DPRK. For example, with nuclear negotiations, with conveying the extent and the capacity of their nuclear programs historically, of sort of embellishing things. Where there's a gap between what's reported and what's real. But as far as these sort of sensationalized stories go, it's really a propaganda war by the U.S. and the South Korean right-wing newspapers. And I mean, if you think about it, that in South Korea, they actually can't even access the Korean Central News Agency's website, right? So the sort of official website of North Korea. And so the lack of information, the lack of access that they have, it makes sense that they would sort of, really lack the context to understand this. And also, they really just run with whatever sensationalized story that they want. The most, I think, egregious example was there was a satirical South Korean newspaper several years ago, like The Onion, right, for South Korea, that ran a story about every male in North Korea having to get the same exact haircut as Kim Jong-un.
Yep.
And the corporate media outlets picked it up as fact, and they ran with it. And the headlines splashed across social media for a day or a couple of days, and then when when the retractions come, they never seem to make the headlines, right? They never make the front page of these news stories. They're never given the same prominence as the original sort of hit piece, and so the damage has really already been done.
That seems to be the kind of procedure for a lot of mainstream news these days anyway, is like, oh, we reported something wrong, we'll bury the retraction, deep in the back of the paper rather than put it up on top. Yeah. The people in North Korea, tragically through all this, I think are treated more like an oddity than human beings by the international press, especially Western media. Does this attitude have an effect when countries are going into peace talks? And is there a cultural side, to the difficulties that we're talking about, and this very, ooh, look at these strange people, this strange culture, rather than treating them as, no, this is a culture here on Earth, just like every other culture. How does that play into the treatment of North Korea?
Yeah. Oftentimes the North Korea is called a hermit kingdom, or, they talk about it being very private and very secretive in the West. But, the reality is that it's not, that North Korea isn't self-isolating, that the United States has isolated it from the entire world. And I think the most, obvious example is the fact that as a U.S. citizen right now, the United States government won't let me travel to North Korea to actually speak to North Korean people. And part of the impetus behind the travel ban for the DPRK and for Cuba is to prevent people in the United States from actually experiencing and understanding Korean culture and what the people in North Korea are like firsthand. Or it's to prevent your neighbor, your uncle, or whatever, your coworker from traveling there, and then they come back and they say, well, let me show you pictures and let me show you videos of what it was actually like and what my experience was like. And so because really, if you think about it, most of the lies that they tell about North Korea are really true things about the United States. So, for example, the idea that they're all only subjected to propaganda that demonizes everybody else. Well, that's actually what we're subjected to. And the idea that they're like a hermit kingdom and so secretive, but it's actually our government that won't let us travel there, that's isolating them. So I think that really the cultural isolation is tragic and is absolutely a big hindrance to the peace process.
It is.
What do you think the press in general, I guess, it needs to do better in covering places like North Korea to help? Because there seems to be two major issues. One is disinformation that is helped along by governments, the United States, South Korea, or like you said, whether it's factions within political regimes, conservative side of South Korea. How do we fight against that disinformation and then the clickbait headlines that so many will use to make bones about that? We have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, what I tell people is your default sort of way in which you receive news about North Korea from corporate media should be either to not believe it or to sort of hold it at bay with extreme skepticism. And I think that if one has, you don't need to be an expert in North Korea to have some context and to be able to discern fact from fiction. You don't need to be like an astute observer all the time. You really just need some basic information about the history of North Korea. And also this sort of disposition or the belief or the attitude that actually, as was said earlier, that this is a country and this is a people and this is a nation and they have traditions and they have customs and habits and they have a right to do things as they want to do without interference from anybody else. And so I think that if you sort of approach if you do some historical research, cursory research even, and then you approach the content that's being delivered in that way, like, well, even if it is true, like, okay, let's think about all the executions that take place in the United States, right? Okay, so maybe there's a bunch of people in prison in North Korea. Well, you know what? They have a smaller percentage of their population in prison than we do in the United States. So maybe we should sort of really address those issues and allow North Korea to determine its own destiny.
I couldn't agree with you more, because I always go to think, you don't throw stones when you're in the glass house. Clean up your own backyard, and then you can start criticizing others and asking them to clean up theirs. That's how a good neighborhood works. I want to thank you so much for coming on our show today, professor at DePaul University, organizer for the Answer Coalition, and author Derek Ford. Always a pleasure to have you on, sir.
Thank you.